We're in a series of lessons called Good News from Mark. Mark is the second book in the New Testament. It tells the story of the life of Jesus, and it's good news. Anybody here want to hear some good news? You know, our world today is full of bad news, isn't it? I mean, it just seems like there's so much stuff, whether it's natural disasters or the threats of war or shootings, and, it was just last Sunday that, 26 people were killed in a church in Texas. And so it's like, wow, there's so much bad news. And then you throw in the firestorm that we've been through, in the past month, and our lives aren't the same. Our city's not the same. It'll never be the same in some ways again. We're going to get back to normal, but it'll be a new normal. It won't be the same normal as before. And I know that with everything going in our lives, the past month has been really difficult. For a lot of people, it's been heart-wrenching. And we need strength and we need comfort. And that's really why this series is so important. Good news. Today we're going to we're about down to the end of this series. We're going to be wrapping things up next week. This week we're going to talk about the struggles that Jesus faced, the trials of Jesus, ultimately his pain, his crucifixion. And next week we're going to wrap it up with the ultimate good news, and that is the fact that Jesus overcame and triumphed over death in the resurrection. Last week, Dustin presented a lesson called The Olive Press, where he had Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane praying to God that he would be delivered, that he wouldn't have to die. And he felt the pressure on him like an olive press, and it actually squeezed out his blood as he was sweating blood. And then he said those words, "Not my will, but your will be done." And what we're going to do this week is we're going to pick up exactly where Dustin left off last week. And we're going to see, in a sense, Jesus got up as he was on his face before the Father. He got up, dusted himself off, and he set out with his face deliberately, knowing everything that was going to happen to him. He set out to face a spiritual firestorm head on, knowing what would happen. He experienced, before the night was over, he would experience betrayal and abandonment and injustice and ridicule, humiliation, torture, and yet he chose it. He embraced it for us. So that when we face terrible struggles, when we face firestorms in our lives, we can know that he understands how we feel. Let's pick it up. It's in our text today is going to begin in Mark chapter 14. We got a lot of text to cover here. Mark chapter 14, beginning in verse 43. It says, just as he was speaking, Jesus is done praying. He's speaking to his disciples. Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Here's the first thing I want us to notice from the text here. When we think about Jesus and what he went through, and that Jesus understands what we're going through, Jesus was betrayed by a friend. It tells us in the text that they came out armed with swords and clubs. Do you know how hilarious that is? I mean, think about it. Here's the creator of the universe, who before he became a man, he held the universe in the palm of his hand, and they're coming out to arrest him with a bunch of little sticks? Really? But then on the other hand, it's tragic and heartbreaking. Because here was Jesus betrayed by Judas, one of his closest friends. And he betrays him with a kiss. Most intimate form of greeting, that a person could have. And this is important for us because anybody here ever experienced betrayal, been betrayed by somebody? It's probably the worst form of pain there is. All of us experience it sometimes. A mate forsakes the sacred vows of marriage and adulterates the most precious relationship between two human beings. A friend gossips about us and with a few words destroys a reputation that has taken us years to build. Co-workers encourage you to be their spokesman and confront an unfair supervisor and promising you they'll back you, and then they throw you under the bus and let you take the blame for it. You know one thing about betrayal? Only a friend can betray you. You can't be betrayed by, well, you can be hurt by enemies, but you can only be betrayed by a friend. Max Lucado writes this about betrayal. It's more than rejection. Rejection opens a wound. Betrayal pours the salt. It's more than loneliness. Loneliness leaves you in the cold. Betrayal closes the door. It's more than mockery. Mockery plunges the knife. Betrayal twists it. It's more than an insult. An insult attacks your pride. Betrayal breaks your heart. Jesus and Judas have been together for 3 years. Jesus has taught him. Jesus has loved him. Jesus has served him. And now in the worst way possible, Judas has betrayed Jesus to his enemies. When you're betrayed, you can know Jesus understands what you're going through. Then in the next verse, verse 50, it says, makes a simple statement, then everyone deserted him and fled. And then it adds this. It says, a young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. Now, that's found only in Mark. And most Bible scholars pretty much agree that this was most likely Mark himself. The writing style in that day, you didn't name yourself, and it's only found in Mark. Mark was a young man. And again, in a way, it's kind of really funny because here's these men, grown men, running away in the middle of the night to like a bunch of scared little girls, and one of them is naked as a jaybird. Now, it's funny, but again, it's heartbreaking. Because when you realize that earlier these men, trusted followers of Jesus, had all promised, we will die for you. And you know what? They would. They would have died for Jesus as long as everything went according to the plan. Because you see, in their paradigm, they had a Messiah. Their paradigm was, he was a military leader. He was going to crush the Romans, destroy them, drive them out of town. And that was their concept. And they believed in Jesus as the Messiah. I mean, they'd seen him stop storms, walk on water, feed thousands of people from a little boy's lunch. They'd seen him, all kinds of things, heal the sick, raise the dead. They believed Jesus could do anything. All he had to do was say a word and lightning would fall and strike his enemies and they'd be dead. But guess what? He didn't do that. He allowed them to arrest him. Wait a minute, whoa, just a minute. This isn't the plan. What's going on? He's not offering any resistance. Where's the lightning bolts? Where's the fire? I'm out of here. Boom. They were gone. He was abandoned by his friends. In his greatest hour of need, Jesus stands completely alone with no one beside him. It's hard enough to face everything he has to face, but to do it alone? Your best friends, your most trusted companions don't even acknowledge they know you. That's like a dagger in your heart. And then a few verses later, the leader of the apostles, Peter, denies that he even knows them 3 different times. Let's twist the dagger a little more. Jesus knows what it feels like to be abandoned. Then in verse 53 in our text, it says, they took Jesus to the high priest. And the chief priests, elders, and teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, I will destroy this man-made temple, and in 3 days I will build another not made by man. Yet even then their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus. "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You've heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death. Jesus was denied every form of justice because pretty much every principle of justice was violated in these trials. Jesus went through a series of trials, one kangaroo court after another, all night long, on into the morning. Some Bible scholars say 7 different trials that he experienced. And the interesting thing, Matthew tells us in Matthew 26 that this group of people, the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, has already met together and decided they're going to kill him. Forget about innocent until proven guilty. Forget about guilty until proven innocent. How about just guilty, period? How about dead man walking? That's who Jesus is. They've already decided it. And every principle of justice is violated in here. Look at some of the things. These are just a few of them right here. The trial was held at night. These are all against Jewish law, Jewish or Roman law. He was not charged when he was arrested. The trial was held the day before a feast. He was struck when he exercised his right of silence. The witnesses did not agree. You know, that must have really frustrated them when that facade of justice came unraveled and the witnesses, all were contradicting each other. He was forced to testify against himself. The death sentence was pronounced the same day as a trial. They changed their charges before Pilate. Pontius Pilate, we'll see in a minute, he was the Roman governor. In the Jewish trial, they accused him of blasphemy. Pilate didn't care if he blasphemed. So when they bring him before Pilate, they say he's guilty of treason. But the most important thing is he was never found guilty. We'll see in a minute, Pontius Pilate said, "I find no wrong in him." Literally, in one sentence, "I find no wrong in him." The next sentence, he said, "Crucify him." So let me ask you, anybody ever experienced injustice? Anybody ever been in a situation where you know you're right and nobody believes you? Nobody's willing to listen to you? I know a young woman who... when she was a child, she was sexually abused by her uncle. And she told her mom about it, and her mother beat her for telling. Now, most of us have, my guess has never experienced that level of injustice, but we've all felt it. And when we do, we can know we have someone in heaven who's experienced injustice. Jesus understands how you feel. Now, the Jewish council meets early in the morning. They bring an indictment of death against Jesus, and they bring him to Pontius Pilate, the governor, because they couldn't actually carry out the death penalty because they were ruled by Rome. And so they bring him before Pilate. And it says there in Mark 15 and verse 10, that Pilate immediately recognized that Jesus wasn't guilty, that they were just jealous of him. And so Pilate begins to try every way he can to get Jesus released. Because, see, Pilate's in a quandary. On the one hand, he doesn't want to kill an innocent man. He does have a little bit of conscience. But on the other hand, he's a politician, and what's one thing every politician cannot afford to do? Go against the people. And so Pilate struggles here with this, and he tries to get Jesus released in all kinds of different ways, and then ultimately he does this. Verse 15, Mark 15:15, wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. It's a whole other thing I don't want to get sidetracked on, a way he tried to get him released. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Now, I read that just like I would say, I want a Big Mac, order fries, and chocolate shake. Had Jesus flogged. Let me tell you, that one little word carries incredible impact. It was unbelievably horrible. Anybody here ever see the movie, The Passion of the Christ? Yeah, that was, you know what it was like. But just in case you're not, I want to briefly describe, without going into too many gory details, what flogging was. A man would be stripped. He would be tied to a post. And the Romans would have two men called lectors on each side of him with whips. like a cat of nine tails, with strips of leather coming out, pieces of bone and metal tied in it, and they would bring it diagonally across his back. And the bone and the metal would just rip into his back. And these men were so skilled at doing this that they could beat a man right up to the point of death, where one more stroke would be a blessing, and then stop. That's what Jesus endured. In fact, Pilate's tact in doing this, notice it says wanting to satisfy the crowd. Pilate was hoping that if he beat Jesus severely enough, that would satisfy the people and he wouldn't have to crucify him. One of the prophecies in Isaiah spoke of Jesus and said he was not even recognizable would not be recognizable as a human being. He was beaten so badly. Now, think about what's happened to Jesus. He's been betrayed. He's been abandoned. He's been denied justice. Now physical torture. Every kind of torture you can imagine. Satan has thrown at Jesus. Physical, mental, emotional, spiritual. But let me tell you, he's only getting started. Because it says in verse 16, he was mocked and made fun of. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. Satan just keeps piling it on. They mocked him. "Oh, King of the Jews." They beat him. They had a crown of thorns on his head and hit him over the head, and then they spit on him. There was no reason for them to spit on him except just to humiliate him. Philip Yancey, in his book, The Jesus I Never Knew, writes this as a dramatization of what might have happened. "Oh, you say you're a king? Hey, Captain, get a load of this. We have us a regular king here, don't we? Well, then, let's all kneel down before his honor. What's this, a king without a crown? Oh, that will never do. Here, Mr. King, we'll fix you a crown, we will, crunch. How's that, a little crooked? I'll fix that. Hey, hold still. My, how modest we are. Well, how about a robe, then? Something to cover that bloody mess on your back. Oh, what happened? Did your majesty have a little tumble?" Here's what's amazing about it. Jesus was dying for them. He was giving his life the ones that were beating him. And at any moment, he could snap his fingers, lightning would fall from heaven, and they would be fried to a crisp. But he took it. I'm going to tell you, that would have been it for me. Hey, who do you think? You know what? I'm the Son of God. I created you. I came to die for you. And if that's how you're going to treat me, forget it. Father, they're not worth it. Take me back to heaven, and it would have been all over. Literally for us too. No hope. Aren't you glad he took it? So he endured betrayal, abandonment, injustice. He was tortured. Then he was mocked and ridiculed. But there's more. Jesus was crucified. It said they brought Jesus to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. And the rest of the chapter describes, what Jesus went through and as he was hanging on the cross and his burial and so forth. But I just want to touch on this briefly, because there's been so much said and written about crucifixion. But just notice this. It was so terrible, so horrific, that it was not even proper to speak of in any form of dignified society. The Roman statesman Cicero said this: "The idea of the cross should never come near the bodies of Roman citizens. It should never pass through their thoughts, eyes, or ears." When somebody was crucified, they were nailed up. Normally, the most common type of cross at this time was actually a T-shaped, They were nailed to the pieces of wood there. Their legs were bent, and they were, hanging like this, because anybody, if you ever hang from your arms, all the weight's on your chest, and you can't breathe. So, pretty soon as you're breathing, you would push yourself up on your legs, gasp for air until you were too weak to hang there, and then you would drop back down. And this would be repeated over and over again until finally you didn't have strength to push yourself up, and you would die from asphyxiation. And that was repeated over and over for Jesus. The cross was designed to torture. It had been invented a couple of hundred years before this as a way to just slowly torture your enemies. It's generally felt to be the most cruel form of death, torturous form of death in the ancient world. In fact, if I'm describing a very painful experience today, I might say the pain was horrible. The pain was what? Excruciating. The word excruciate is a Latin word that means out of the cross. When somebody says the pain was excruciating, they're telling the story of the cross. But more than that, it was also designed to humiliate, because, you see pictures. Where's Stephen Kessler? He he had a cross this morning. He had Jesus hanging on the cross, and he's got a nice little loincloth on. Guess what? They were crucified naked in a public place. Torture and humiliation. Now, I've tried not to lay this on too thick. I mean, there's a lot of preachers that really do this, but it is important for us to understand what Jesus went through for this reason right here. Whether you see the things and that is because whatever you're going through, Jesus understands. Have you ever talked to someone who has no clue? You're struggling with something, and you need to talk to somebody. You try to talk to them, and they have no clue as to what you're going through. I remember years ago, my wife and I, for years, hosted a college group in our home, and there was this one young lady at the end of the meeting that we were having. She says, "I really need prayer because I just found out my brother's dying of cancer. He only has 3 months to live." And we were helping her process it. And one of the other young women in the group said, "Well, here's what I do. Every morning when I get up, I look in the mirror and I say, every day in every way, life's getting better and better." Really? That's the comfort that you have to offer. And she obviously if I were her, I would have said, "Never mind." Okay. Let me just tell you, that's not God. God doesn't just say, "Come on, put on a happy face, look in the mirror, lift yourself up, by your bootstraps, and you're going to be okay, doggone it." He's not sitting in some golden throne up in heaven. Jesus entered into every aspect of human suffering so that we can know that He knows how we feel. He's been through it all. He put it all on, took it all on Himself. And that's so important because some of us are still in shock from what happened with the fire. Some of us are still searching for meaning. The police are telling us that expect a lot of traffic accidents, a spike in traffic accidents over the next few months as reality begins to set in. The stress becomes more and more real. And so where do we turn for strength and comfort in our lives? Whether you're a victim of the fire or whatever, there's no better place for us to turn than Jesus because He understands. Because He experienced such great loss in every way in His life. Jesus understands what it feels like to lose everything. That's what God wants you to know. I understand how you feel. I really do. I've pondered this question. Why did Jesus go through all of this? I mean, He could have died a quick and simple death. All He had to do was shed His blood. How come before the foundation of the world it wasn't planned for Jesus to be beheaded and die for us that way? Why did He have to go through the abandonment and the betrayal and all that kind of stuff? And I really believe one of the reasons, at least one reason, is so you could know that He knows how you feel. When you experience great loss and you go to God in gut-wrenching anguish, He can respond by putting his arms around you and say, child, I understand. We have someone in heaven who understands. Whatever it is. He didn't keep himself from one single experience of anguish, even though he could have. He was willing to go through it all. So we could run to him and fall in his arms for strength and comfort and hope. He chose to identify with our pain, like Father Damien did. Father Damien was a priest who moved to the island of Molokai in Hawaii, where there was a leper colony that had been quarantined. And he served them for 16 years. He taught them, he served them, he spoke their language, he bandaged their wounds, he hugged them, he ate with them. He organized schools and bands and choirs, and he built homes for them. He built 2,000 coffins so they could die with dignity. And it came to be said that that leper colony was a place to live rather than a place to die. And then one day he stood up and began his sermon with these words, "We lepers." And at that point, he wasn't just helping them. At that point, he was one of them. And 2,000 years ago, God entered this world in human form. He went through every form of suffering we could, and in doing so, he was saying, "We lepers. I'm one of you. I join with you in your suffering." But Jesus did so much more than that. That's where we're going to go next week with the victory of the resurrection. I guess I'll give you a spoiler alert. Jesus died, he was buried, but he rose from the dead. It wouldn't be much good news if we just left him hanging on the cross there, stuck in the tomb. He overcame, and because of that, we can experience his victory. We can rise above the ashes that we find ourselves in life. Because Jesus meets us in the midst of our struggles, but he doesn't leave us there to wallow in our pain. He lifts us up so we can rise and rule with him. We have a group of ladies who are here today. You guys want to come on up, who are going to do a beautiful interpretive dance for us to help us understand what it looks like to rise. I think the message in here is going to be clear. One of struggle, one of pain, and one of overcoming and rising. Beautiful and powerful. Thank you for that. You know, it's more powerful than words, isn't it? So I just want to say this, that the message of Jesus is a message of struggle and pain and hardship, but it's ultimately a message of victory. You can't have victory without struggles. You can't have triumph without tragedy. And that's what the story represents. And the message that's on there, rise, rise out of the ashes. That's what God is doing in our lives. And we have the model of Jesus to show us what that really looks like. Maybe you're here this morning and you want to run to Jesus. You want to run to his arms. Maybe you just need somebody to put their arms around you and say, "I'm a representative of Jesus, and I'm here to help you heal. I'm just here to listen." Or maybe it's a victory that you're saying, "I need the victory that Jesus promises." And so we're going to have a prayer team up here in just a moment. And also over here is communion as a reminder, not just of the struggles that Jesus faced, but of the fact that he rose, and he tells us we can rise. So, Father, we just come to you today thanking you. Thanking you for the fact that you understand, that Jesus understands, and that we have victory through him. All power, glory, and honor go to Jesus today. In his name we pray. Amen. God bless you.